Okay, thanks very much, Simon. So first of all, apologies to everyone for having two Simons and creating a little bit of confusion. But I've been very kindly invited to chair a panel discussion today with Duncan Baker-Brown and with Sumita Singha, who are our guests on the panel, to talk about material use and ethics. Before we get into the discussion, and we will encourage you to post questions and join us in a discussion in a few minutes. But to start us off with, it will be nice to have a brief introduction. And rather than me carry that out, we thought it would be great to hear from each of our guests. So, Sumita, would you like to kick us off with a little of your background and how you came to get involved in the world of material use and ethics in particular?
Thank you, Simon, and another Simon. Thank you all. Thank you all for attending today. So I'm Sumita Singha. I'm the Director of Ecologic Architects. I actually studied architecture in India, and I've been working with low energy materials such as earth, straw, and bamboo since 1986. I've worked in India, France, and the UK using these materials. I'm also a huge fan of retrofit and reuse of materials, which links in nicely with Duncan's passion as well. I feel that natural materials have a living connection with the occupants in a way that man-made materials don't. These materials are also recyclable and biodegradable. I set up a course on urban construction at Plymouth University in the early 90s, which is apparently still running. I have run training workshops, writing, and I've been writing and teaching about low energy materials. In 2022, I know you probably can't see this, my book, Architecture for Rapid Change and Scarce Resources, was published. And more than 12 years ago, no one was talking about scarcity of materials and user-friendly construction methods, which this book talks about. I'm pleased to say this book has been adopted in the US for design courses, especially as the US is a major contributor to greenhouse gases. However, a lot more needs to be done, especially where building materials are concerned, and especially their reuse. While the amount of material consumed by humanity has passed 100 billion tons since 2017, the proportion being recycled has been falling. This means that virgin materials are being used up since that time while building waste has been growing. So literally we are like, making a huge hole in the earth, taking stuff out and putting rubbish in. Treating the world's resources as limitless and the belief in a linear economy are driving the planet to disastrous consequences. Sourcing local building materials should be a priority for all architects, followed by the reduction of material needs and reuse of waste. Recycling should be the last resort because many building materials cannot be usefully recycled, reused, or restored to their original conditions. Anything such as glass, plastics, stone, brick, concrete, etc. Next slide, please. So I attended COP28 in Dubai last November along with Duncan. I observed that no one was talking about the ecological and human impact of the extraction of materials and the very fact that we're running out of materials to use. Sand and clay have become the world's most trafficked minerals. The trafficking is often carried out by criminal gangs. Such actions put the local ecology and people in danger. We're running out of building sand globally. In the UK, another material used for making bricks, clay, is only going to last about, extraction of clay is only going to happen until about another 400 years. This photo that you see now is my village in India, 30 years apart. All the fine sand from both sides of the river along its entire course has been stolen by gangs for construction projects. The villages in the meanwhile have no bridge to cross the river. The sole means of crossing this broken bamboo bridge that you can see is unusable literally, especially during high monsoon time. Big transnational corporations such as those for cement and concrete, big oil, OPEC, and the big wealthy nations took center stage at COP28. Not a bad thing considering that they need to change first. But fast fashion, which is responsible for more carbon emissions than shipping and aviation, were missing in that discussion. And interestingly, fast fashion, which can't be disposed of, is actually being sent to poor countries to be used in brick kilns to burn those for firing bricks. And that is causing more pollution and toxicity. If you look at the room where you are sitting, most things there have been shipped. So next slide, please. So there is a disconnection between where the material is being extracted from, who's producing it, who's manufacturing it further, and exporting it and transporting it, and finally to the user. So there's a huge kind of chain which we don't look at in the way that we've started looking at food, for example. Also, the other important conversations that were missing in COP28 included things like what alternative energy sources could be in 2030, which is just 6 years away, how different countries could find different solutions that work for them. Not all solutions will work for rich or poor countries. What can individuals do? Or even small businesses like those for architects, small practices can do. What exactly does green growth look like? How would carbon from unabated fossil fuels be captured? For those who are not familiar, unabated fossil fuel means those produced and used without interventions that substantially reduce the amount of greenhouse gases throughout their life cycle. So I'm hoping that these thorny discussions can be discussed thoroughly today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sumita. Well, I'm sure we'll definitely come back to pick up on some of those points in a few moments. But before we do, if I can hand over to Duncan, if you'd like to share your slides and give us a little of your background.
Yeah, thank you. I'll briefly just introduce myself. I've got too many slides, so Simon, just say Duncan stop. But thank you, Sumita. That was a brilliant presentation. Like Sumita, I've been sort of in the world of sustainable design for 30 years. So it is 30 years. Since 1994, I built something called Future House in Milton Keynes, and that was an off-grid RIBA competition. Actually, in the same year, I started teaching and researching at the University of Brighton, and via University of East London and a bit of UCL, I've carried on teaching, researching, and practicing around these issues. I'm probably best known for some one-off house projects that test ideas around sustainability. So in 2008, I designed and constructed the house that Kevin built, which was sort of a live version of Grand Designs, and we built in 6 days a prefabricated dwelling, first A+ dwelling in the UK, and that was testing the idea that most of the materials could be carbon locking and organic, and we did that. Over 90% of what that building was made of those materials. And I spent about, up until then, about sort of 10 years, coming up until the 10 years ago, focusing on locally sourced organic materials. But then I felt like I was neglecting the big issue, which is that at the time, 10 years ago, for every 5 houses we were building in the UK, 1 house worth of materials got thrown away. And so I then did a project called the Waste House, which is not a house, it's a 2-story teaching facility, which is 55 tons of material other people threw away. And it performs to Passive House standards. It's not a house, it's a 2-story teaching facility on campus at the University of Brighton, and that's inspired lots of other research projects. But I'm gonna hit on touch on a couple of things that Sumita mentioned, so I'll skim over some of my slides, but I will share my slides. And if Simon, you could just tell me if you can see them.
We can, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So quickly, yeah. I mean, this is what Sumita was talking about. We're up to about between 125 and 135 billion tons of materials mined and harvested annually. 2010, it was half of that amount. And the construction sector consumes half of that. So, you know, and the extraction of materials and harvesting of timber, etc., is one of the main reasons we've got the mass extinction of species at the moment, because we're destroying their habitat with this. In the UK, we consume 60 million tons of products every year. 200 million tons of that is waste, and over 60% of that is from the construction sector. About 120 million tons of material from our construction sites goes to landfill and incineration every year. And that sort of embodied carbon, the amount of stuff consumed to make things. In the rest of Europe, the percentage of waste from construction sites, the percentage of the whole national figure, is down to about 35 to 45%. So we are our sector in the UK is very wasteful. We're also 45% of carbon emissions in terms of operational maintenance and stuff. So humankind needs to learn how to manage planet Earth's resources, and it's us that does it, designers and constructors. So it's all about managing resources and dramatically reducing the need to consume new raw materials. Some good news, we are in an impactful business. If you design a 10 meter by 10 meter concrete slab and you make it 50 mil skinnier than normal, you'll save as much carbon as avoiding meat for a year. The other good news is everybody's asking, what is a circular economy? Some more good news. People winning big prizes talk about never demolish, never replace. Students are demanding to be taught the right stuff. Even this guy last year, he won the Pritzker Prize as well. And he said, retrofit is not only the right thing to do, and I believe this, it's the more interesting thing to do. People have been put in prison in the name of retrofitting our homes. So at the moment, I think our built environment is unaffordable to occupy, increasingly uninhabitable or irrelevant. Our commercial spaces are underused, our homes are overused, we're overheating in summer and getting cold in the winter, and we're not even thinking about being climate resilient. So our government needs to plan and coordinate and fund the rolling out of a national retrofit program across the UK. To use an old-fashioned terminology, it's a nationwide levelling up project. Everybody can get involved in this, but that's nearly 28 million homes. And that's only our homes. It's the whole built environment that needs to be adapted to be low carbon and climate resilient. So we need to teach the right skills and meet the massive challenge and engage our best design teams, because retrofit has to be a lot more than just external wall insulation and solar panels. But resource security is a thing of the past. We have to stop using new resources whenever possible. And this, Sumita used the imagery of a great big hole. There is the great big hole. That's the amount of copper you get out of a hole that size. So the global north has processed more than its fair share of resources. We have parted for 250 years in England. And I'm specific about England because we have. But we are, you know, the global north, as it's called, in some areas, is responsible for over 90% of the emissions that are causing the current climate and ecological emergency. So I would proffer to you guys that we need to close all conventional mines. There's an open mine somewhere. And we need to reuse the previously manufactured. And this is an infographic I came up with my book in 2017, the Reuse Atlas. So we need to mine the Anthropocene or the Anthroposphere, rework the already manufactured, the thing that's already got its carbon and ecological footprint, and relieve the burden on the natural world to provide new resources. Good news, we actually know what to do. And I've got an updated version of the book coming out in August. Now, one reason for dwelling on that is to remind you guys that, but this Reuse Atlas has got 40 case studies in it now. The first edition had 26. And the reason this book's 2 years late is because there's so much good stuff going on. Simon, how much longer have I got?
A couple of minutes and then we'll open up the discussion.
Well, I'll talk to you briefly about a technique that's picked up on in the Reuse Atlas, which is full of case studies of buildings at different scales, some pretty big scales, where clients and design teams and communities are deconstructing buildings instead of demolishing them. Networks of demolition contractors are becoming deconstruction contractors and supplying the built environment with secondhand material for new and retrofitted buildings. And the technique they're employing is resource mapping, understanding what's on your site in terms of resources, and that can be human resources as well, and networks, but you know, the physical resources of the building. So that's why it might be a retrofit project instead of a new build. But when you look at resource mapping, you're looking at what's on site, what's in the immediate locale, what's in the region. And you might be identifying future material sources from future building sites, for example. So I'm going to leave you with this image, actually, because this is me working on an infographic that describes the material sources for buildings that you're looking at now. So the project in the middle is a retrofit or new build project that you're working on at the moment. So you prioritize what's on site, what you can reuse, and then you mine the anthroposphere, which is the blue arrow. So you reuse pre-formed existing stuff whenever possible, and then you also harvest in a regenerative way from the biosphere. And that's possible. You know, where I am just north of Brighton, we've got a lot of coppice sweet chestnut. If you manage those woodlands, you create a greater level of biodiversity than if you leave them alone. The root system of a coppice woodland might be 400 or 500 years old, but the timber growth is only 25 to 30 years old. So that's the idea. If it's organic, it's regenerative. If it's inorganic, it's secondhand. After you've done that, you're then doing what everybody else always does, which is to import new stuff. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you earlier, Sumita, for your introduction. Well, I'm completely sold. I think I was before the call, to be fair, but there's some really powerful messaging there. But I think one of the key questions, and perhaps Sumita, I can put this to you first, is you both clearly have a lot of passion. There's a very strong argument behind what you're proposing and what we need to be aware of. But if I've just logged onto this call and maybe seen this for the first time, and at 1 o'clock I'm going to be logging off, probably get some lunch, and then at 2 o'clock I'm back to my architect's board or my quantity surveying or whatever part of the built environment I'm working in, what should be my first step, Sumita, in trying to understand a little bit more and influence material use in the building that I'm designing or constructing?
Sorry, I was on mute. I think the first thing is look at the design and kind of do an audit of the site. What exists over there? It's like the last slide that Duncan showed. What is there that we can use, whether it's like literally the earth, whether it's, trees around there, if we can cut them, but I'd rather not cut down trees. But, just see what it is that we can use there, and then start to think what it is that I can get from somewhere else that's being thrown away that I can reuse. I think the mentality is when we start designing, we just think, oh, we're going to put this glazing over there and that steel over there, and this is going to be. There is a lot of thought given to materials, but only in terms of new materials and what we can see. And the NBS and other places don't actually encourage us to think about reuse very much. And the same way, buildings that win prizes, those are buildings that are new often. Most of the time, they're new buildings with new virgin materials. They're not buildings that have been built using waste. And I think the mindset should really change from that point that you start drawing your first sketch and thinking, what can I reuse over here?
Excellent. Yeah. So, I mean, and that is a key part of design in itself, is actually taking a step back right at the beginning and seeing what your constraints are, in this case around materials, and sort of assessing where to start. Duncan, if I can come to you and maybe throw in an extra challenge, which is Sumita's described perhaps a site, perhaps a sort of rural site or a single building. As we know, a huge part of global development in the built environment is likely to be in cities. More and more of us are moving to cities continually across the globe. So I'm unlikely to find a sort of a hazel coppice or whatever in my backyard. It would be fantastic, but probably not. So how would I take a similar approach, but in a city environment? Let's say London.
Let's say I was born in Epping Forest. Epping Forest shouldn't exist. It starts in Walthamstow and ends up in Essex, beyond Epping. It's a 600-year-old woodland that was pollarded. So, we have a history in London of preserving woodlands when they become useful. So, and London is still pretty much surrounded by a green belt, and a lot of that green belt is wooded. And actually, if you're thinking regionally, harvested coppiced sweet chestnut from Sussex and actually Essex as well is actually local material for London. So there's that side of it. But I echo a bit of what Sumita says. You've got to be thinking at it at the beginning. We're quite often, as a practice, asked to come along and join in with projects when it's on site or got planning approval and beyond, and it's a bit late. It needs to be folded in as an aspiration right at the beginning. And I think the good news is there are lots of cities and towns that are now having circular economy route maps for this for the built environment. So Brighton and Hove City has one, and it's already been impactful on relatively large projects. So they've got a pretty ordinary 60-unit housing scheme in Portslade, 5 stories high, and instead of the ubiquitous in situ cast concrete frame, floor and walls, which is what we've got everywhere suddenly, it's a steel frame bolted together. And so one day that steel frame can be unbolted. So I think if we can get in early enough and change the briefs, design teams will respond to a brief. Brighton Hove as a city has not just, because of doing that, has not just built more expensive units than normal. It's the same price. So I think a lot of this is a lot of sort of low-lying fruit and quite straightforward things that can make a massive change. Some of the more complicated and stuff will need legislation and other incentives to enable. And complicated things mean no VAT or equitable VAT situation on retrofit and new build, which isn't at the moment. But I sit on the UK Net Zero Carbon Building Standard Governance Board, and that's going to supply a set of rules for our industry, so we know how to spend our meager carbon budget. And we're going to be lobbying ministers and central government to acknowledge embodied carbon. And as soon as that's acknowledged and part of building regulations, everybody will be wanting to retrofit.
Yeah, so that's a really powerful opportunity, isn't it? At the government level.
I think that's only a couple of years away. I think, and
yeah.
It's not just retrofit. There'll be incentives for reuse.
Well, Duncan, I was thinking that both of us teach as well, and I think that education of architects has to change. That mindset that you start right from the beginning with, what can you reuse is not taught while we are studying architecture, and that's where it all begins. That mindset of reusing, using less, and doing an audit. We used to do things like site survey, but we looked at which way the sun is and the wind and all that. But now we have to start looking at materials.
And I think, Sumita, I think that's rapidly changing. I think if we look at the graduation shows at schools of architecture and engineering this year, I think that's changing. I know quite a lot of studios, my own included, but there are other, that are doing this. I think, and I just noticed in the Architects Journal when they do features on new practices, they're saying this, that they're only going to be dealing with retrofit and reuse. So I think it's an aspiration, but I also know that there are strategic plans with towns and cities around the UK that are encouraging this, and I don't think legislation is going to be far away. Even with the Conservative government, we've had a sort of embodied carbon bill presented 3 times to Parliament, and it's almost got through, presented by the Conservative Party. So I'm hoping that soon it will be passed, and soon as you're benchmarking embodied carbon, a lot of other things fall out of that. I mean, we haven't talked about ethics too much yet, but
no. But the thing is, when I wrote my book in 2012, 75% of new buildings, or the buildings we needed in Western Europe, had already been built.
Yeah.
So there's actually a very small need now in 2024 to have new buildings. So the mindset for the next generation of architects has to be completely different, and we're not teaching that. So anyway, yes, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great point, and we've already got a superb takeaway there that is literally taking this 1 or 2 hours at the beginning of a project to have a look at the site and to understand what's already there. We've got a number of questions now starting to come in the chat, which is great. So Matteo is asking one which I think picks up Duncan on potentially on the ethics side. So given that we now aspire to reuse materials where we can, there will inevitably be certain materials that we need to source externally. So how do we, Sumita, if I can come to you first, you showed that really powerful image of the exploitation of sand in your local village. How do we go about ethically resourcing projects with sort of raw materials like sand, like clay and so on?
There's that directory, the environmental product, which gives you sort of the, almost it tries to tell you that this particular product is eco-friendly, etc. And it's got all sorts of the EDP, everyone's kind of talking about it. But when I looked further into it, some of the entries were like, we use recycled cardboard for packaging, and that's what got them in, got them a tick box thingy,
Yeah.
and got them in there. So I think we have to really question. The other thing I sort of mentioned was using local stuff, and Duncan's mentioned that as well. So, if we can use local materials, we can be doubly sure that, we haven't actually exploited other poorer people for getting that. Particularly, a lot of our stuff, as I said, we don't know where it's being produced. And I think Matteo or someone said that, and it's very true, there was trees being chopped off in Ghana, which said they were FSC wood, but they actually weren't. They were from, pristine forests that were being taken from forests. So I think if we can, source locally, source reuse materials in the way that we go and shop in charity shops for clothes, we already know they have been used and produced, so we might as well use them. So those kind of things, if we can do those in our building projects, that would be great. I'm doing a project in India at the moment, which is called 4 Villas. And one of the things I said to the client was, the buildings there are from the British colonial times. They are so in such a state that actually you can't use them in any use. So I said, we'll take down every brick, every stone, and we'll make sure it's used on site. And that way, in poorer countries where there is exploitation of labor, like I mentioned, the sand and the brick issues, we're quite sure that at least most of the building will be constructed using what is there already on site.
Excellent. Thanks, Sumita, and hopefully, Matteo, that gives you a little bit of feedback to a little bit of an answer around your question. Duncan, I don't know if you've got anything you'd like to add. Again, you've mentioned the buildings that you've been involved in much more locally to Brighton.
Well, no, I was just thinking of I think if you're reusing stuff that's nearby, or you're encouraging the deconstruction of a building that was up for demolition, you know where it is, you know what's coming off it. And crucially, I think in this country, we're pretty good around the health and safety and the and looking after people on site. So if you're creating a new development, whether it's retrofit or new build, and it's made out of deconstructed elements from a building in the UK or in Europe, I think you can be rest assured that it's been done in an ethical way. So that's I think that picks up on what Sumita was saying. I would also say, with regard to sand, as Sumita said again, with our cities, I think we've got the concrete and brick infrastructure that we need. And I think we've got to adapt that. And I think we should be questioning ourselves if we're bringing in more concrete to the situation. And I would say that what we'd be bringing in is another layer that will apply to the buildings. I mean, I think retrofit has to be a lot more creative than just external wall insulation and solar panels. We can't afford it. It often isn't done properly. Sorry, did someone say that?
I think it was just some background noise.
Is it
Sorry. Carry on,
Duncan.
Duncan.
Okay, So I don't think we can afford it, but we can often, if we adapt a building, whether it's number 1 Triton Square, where they've reused 9 stories of curtain wall system in the City of London, for British Land, but they extended the building as well. Whether it's a project like that or a residential project or whatever, if you're bringing in new material, this can be carbon locking organic material, and that can bear its weight on the existing concrete and masonry stuff. So I think that approach means you're using a lot less sand. The new Design Museum extension in Ghent, at the moment they're making 100,000 bricks for the extension made out of waste from the building site itself. They're not using sand. They're hydraulically compacting waste clay and other material that's been dug out for the extension. And because the mayor of Ghent was so excited at the project, they're adding other waste streams just to highlight the fact that bricks can be made out of waste, which is, by the way, what we did in the UK until about 1861, where we got so rich on our plundered material from our empire that we started making bricks out of brand new stuff. So some of it is remembering what we used to do when we weren't so resource irresponsible.
Yeah, I think that is a good point, that actually when we have relative riches, we tend not to care quite so much about things, and when we're conscious of the cost to ourselves, it becomes more visible. So I think there's an important lesson there. We've got another question in the chat from Pete Marsh, who's asking about something that I've not heard of, but I guess I can understand. He's saying he saw an infographic last week that showed that 15% of materials ordered in the USA are put aside for attic stock, by which I assume he means sort of stockpiling materials. Correct us if I'm wrong, Pete. Sumita, have you come across that as a practice, or are you aware of quantities in that?
Well, I mean, I think that could be something linked with COVID, because I know during COVID there was a shortage of materials, and also when we had the shipping lanes blocked or something happens, then building materials are not transported from one place to the other. I think the Suez Canal caused a lot of problems. So I think that it could be linked to that. There's a pandemic, or I remember all the loo rolls vanished, from the supermarket shelves.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, Pete's joined us on the call now with his Pete, if you want to come off mute and maybe you can add to your question.
Hi there. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it was a new one for me as well. I did work in the US, but I hadn't come across that. And apparently, it was universities or big local governments stockpiling for future maintenance or future issues like that. The issue being that 15, 20 years down the line, if they wanted to reuse that tile, it was obsolete and often got discarded. So they were saying 15% of the waste was just stuff that was put aside for potential future use that was never actually used. I was just wondering if either of the panelists had come across that in the UK or Europe.
Duncan, any thoughts?
Yeah, well, there's common practice with all of us, including quantity surveyors, that there's always this is 10% for wastage, and that's one of the reasons that we have surplus material. I don't know if I think we're still there really, but the practice of building in Europe and in the UK, which I'm most familiar with, is that you overorder. And so all that overordering, that's why 10-15% of waste flows from construction sites are actually surplus materials that have never been used. So we've got to order and quantify and design buildings and that are manufactured off-site, because then you reduce that over-ordering stuff. But I can imagine stockpiling because of the resource scarcity at the moment. I can imagine people have got the money and stockpiling resources, and that's again why there's a resource scarcity, because it's just like supermarkets running out of margarine or whatever it was.
Yeah, so I guess, Pete, we're acknowledging that we've not come across it a lot, but it's certainly not going to be a good practice if we're looking to manage our resources more responsibly. I did want to throw a question in. Maybe I can come to you first, Duncan, on this one, because I seem to have labelled you as cities, but I've been doing some work with the UK Green Building Council. We've been looking at materials reuse, and one of the big challenges has been, okay, let's assume now that we would love to just reuse all building materials, and we have the capacity to and the knowledge of how to do that. How do we go about stockpiling, storing, labeling those materials so that we can do it at scale?
Yeah, you may or may not be aware then, Simon, that there are feasibility studies being done by cities all over the UK at the moment, looking at the physical and digital infrastructure required to facilitate reuse. And I was just on a phone call this morning with some people from Royal Borough, Kensington and Chelsea wanting to do the same thing. What do I do with 1,500 windows that we don't want now? We might never want, or perhaps we will. So we need what some people call circular economy construction hubs, warehouses basically, but they do need to be warehouses that can receive deconstructed material, which will then need to be cleaned up, made reusable, and crucially given the warranties that it needs. So people like British Land will touch the stuff. Now that stuff is emerging, and we're beginning to get an emergent supply chain that can do this. So for example, there are companies now who are actively surveying and deconstructing buildings because they know they've got a steel frame of a certain size and performance, and there's a market for secondhand steel because we've got one or two companies that are prepared to put a warranty against the secondhand steel frame. As soon as you got the warranty, you've got the market. And that's what they had with the Arup project for British Land at number 1 Triton Square. Because the building that was going to be demolished at one time was only 19 years old, the supply chain was still intact. So they went back to the suppliers of the curtain wall system and said, would you deconstruct, clean up, upgrade and reassemble plus warranties? And they said, of course, we know what the product is, we'll do that. And that is happening very rapidly across Europe at the moment, and it will come to support the UK soon. The supply chain will be doing pre-loved versions of their goods with warranties. Now the remanufacturing, well, sorry, I didn't mention that word. I call these circular economy construction hubs remanufacturers. I think the first wave of these needs to have an R&D element. So it needs to be a partner project with an academic institution, and we need to do the research required to see what to do to elevate the value and the reuse capacity of all these different components in the built environment. And the other thing we've got to acknowledge is when you reuse, you have to recycle as well. There are these waste streams that come off of reuse projects. And that's a lot of work's been done at the moment on that as well, how we can make materials out of recycled stuff off construction sites.
Excellent. Yeah, so it's really encouraging to hear. I know I've found that certainly over the last 12 months is each time you pose an imponderable question, you then find 3 conversations later you're talking to someone that's already doing it or has a way of tackling it, which is really positive. Sumita, if I'd like to shift the conversation slightly, so we've mentioned a couple of times the global north, and Duncan, I think, has alluded to the fact in the UK at least we've had 250 years where we've basically been able to party, I think was your turn, Duncan, and certainly without any thought for exploits. So let's just assume now that those of us in the global north recognize what we've done. We stop tomorrow, or hopefully at 1 o'clock today at the end of this call, in using materials. Well, that's great, but what about the global south? What about the developing countries where you don't have the same infrastructure and so on? How do you see those economies and those countries developing in the next 10, 20, 30, 50 years, given the constraints that we have, unfortunately, on planet Earth, and the fact that the global north has pretty well used most of it up?
Yeah, so I think there are a couple of things here which induces or encourages people to try and live like the global north, because that is seen as a sign of progress. Okay, so the rich Indians, for example, want to live like the rich Americans, and there are so many billionaires. I mean, there was this recent wedding at which Mark Zuckerberg and Rihanna and all these global celebrities were there, and they had pools of champagne and I don't know whatever else. So there is this idea that that is progress. So until we in the North can show what progress means reuse, and progress means using less resources, then no one else in the global South is going to follow that, because for like about 100 years or even more, they've been shown that this is what progress looks like. This is what good looks like. And therefore, they want also to be like that. The local architecture, vernacular architecture has almost disappeared in many of those poorer countries. And I have to say that, because you called us in because of our attendance at the COP28, and there was this loss and damage payment to poorer countries, which was agreed on the first day, and everyone said, "Oh, that's a winner." But the thing is that those agreements were actually watered down versions of what was agreed earlier in COP21, I think, in Paris 2015, and the number of countries which have been affected by our partying, as Duncan mentioned, the amount will not be enough to cover the damage. So that's the second point. And I think the thing is, we have to sort of somehow encourage poorer countries without sort of being like patronizing, saying, "Oh, look, we've changed our tack, so do what we're doing." I would love to see more examples of reuse projects winning prizes, which are up on magazines, global online magazines such as Zine, so that people see, like, this is where the world is going. These are the problems we have with we don't have enough materials. So I think we also need to agree what net zero means, because that was another thing at COP. Nobody knows what the definition of net zero is, or where we are actually going. And there was also this is my thing, what are sort of scope 3 emissions, which are part of the building, which we don't talk about, all this nebulous production, which is not produced by the building, but through services that the building needs. And a lot of the countries, in the poorer countries, they are getting really warm. They use air conditioning, for example, more and more than using air conditioning, which actually increases the problem of greenhouse gases. So I think we got to do two things. One is to actually show the world that there's a different way. And then secondly, of course, we must pay the loss and damage reparations that we've agreed in Paris, not the ones that were agreed in Dubai.
Excellent. Thank you, Sumita. You segued nicely into a question from Saul Humphrey in the chat, which is a pretty challenging one, and I guess it's coming your way, Duncan, in the interests of fairly distributing questions. I'm going to read it out. If we accept that perpetual growth on a finite planet is impossible, how do we shift our political and economic aspirations for growth? So in other words, how do we get away from the business model that we've followed for the last 250 years in the global North, towards one where we protect and actually value caring for our planet over and above unsustainable growth?
Until Elon Musk's mega rocket actually takes off and can take people onto Mars to live somewhere else, we are on this little planet all together, and we are all being affected by the problems associated with the climate and ecological emergency right now, all the time. Whether it, where do we get our food from, etc., floods, famine, fire, the whole thing. You can't be rich enough to avoid it. Okay, you can be rich enough to run away from bits of it sometimes, fly off away from a fire, wherever it is. But the reality is we're right in the middle of all of this now. And the insurers know this. The insurance industry knows it, and it's one of the most powerful industries. So if you can't get your thing insured, you won't get your investors. It all falls down very quickly. We know what financial markets are like. So I think there's enough people understanding this who are making provision in a positive way to go down a route that doesn't require perpetual growth. I did a podcast the other week with Kate Rayworth, who's an economist who wrote a book called Donut Economics. And so if you think of a donut drawn in, you've got the inner ring and the outer ring. And basically, if you're hurting humans, you've gone within the inner ring. If you're hurting the planet, your economic plan has gone beyond the outer ring. We know how to make economic plans that don't just rely on Keynesian methods that are 100 years old now. So there are still vested interests, but still, you know, if you're the chair of BP or whoever, where are you going? Where's this planet that's all right? It's affecting you as well. So I think, unfortunately, there's going to be some challenging things which are going to, we're Sumita and I are both campaigning for something called a just transition. You know, we want to bring poor people. It's not only rich people who can afford to employ circular techniques and live on this planet in a healthy, desirable way without destroying it. I think the planet will make us change our mind. But I do know that there are significant companies and institutions out there trying to change their linear systems into circular ones and going for degrowth. I also say, and it was so disappointing that Keir Starmer pulled away from the investment in green industries. There's a huge opportunity with green industries for fair and equitable green industries. And we just need to transition very quickly towards them. We don't need to invest in fossil fuel companies anymore. Clean energy is cheaper. Get on with it. You know, it's just some old people. I don't know where they think they're going to live, because there isn't a place on the planet that isn't affected now. So, you know, I don't know. It's really rapid, the change.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I think it's a really positive message in that, you know, I mean, highlighting, for example, the insurance industry and other big financial players. We do work and operate in an economic and commercial environment. So having those pressures, I think it has a potential to very quickly change things. Sumita, I want to ask you a little bit sort of leading on from that. So we're highlighting all the things that we need to do, particularly those of us that have caused the most damage, talking again about the global north. But that's an awful lot to do, and we need to do it. But again, there's the tendency that we'll just retreat into our bubble, say, hang on a minute, you know, I can't fly to New York on holiday anymore because it's using too much carbon. I'm going to have to find ways of working at home. And again, we forget about the other parts of the world which are far more significantly affected. So how do we bring about this just transition? How do we really engage right across the planet so that those who aren't currently at the table now and have a strong enough voice, how do we get them engaged in the process?
I think it's very important to have a holistic picture. And again, you know, to look at the user and the land, the connection between the user and land, you know, in greater detail. So, for example, we're all being told, well, you're going to use electric cars, you know, but the battery has lithium in it. Now, lithium is a rare metal. And apparently, a lot of the salt flats in South America contain lithium. And the lithium's going to be mined from there, or they're going to get the lithium out of deep sea mining. Again, a very controversial project, because Greenpeace has said, you know, that's going to destroy the ecosystems at the bottom of the ocean. So, you know, I think the idea that we can all drive around in electric cars with lithium batteries, you know, we have already, I mean, I'm using a laptop and, you know, desktop, which have lithium batteries in that, but I try and sort of use them as much as I can, because I know the lithium can't be extracted and reused. So I think the thing is to cut down on your use. I think the people who've had the party, as Duncan put it, need to actually, you know, cut down. It's like, you know, it's like this huge table, right? And everyone's, there's people at one end who've got a lot of food and they're eating it, and they're throwing the rubbish to the other side of the table and saying to the poor people, well, you got to have the scraps of, you know, that we're throwing out. But it's the thing of sharing, you know, the food and the waste together, because I know a lot of our waste also goes to these poor countries who can't deal with it. I was talking about this brick kilns that are using fashion waste to fire bricks. So I think the thing is to see how can we achieve equity together. It's everyone together. It's not like us versus them, which is often the thing. You know, people say, oh, big companies like BP will say, oh, we've got to respond to our shareholders. Well, you know, shareholders, but what about the stakeholders, if there's a better word for it, you know, where the oil is being extracted from? So I think that we can all live well if we all share.
I really, that picture you've created in my mind of large table, and I think you're right, it is about we are all sat around that table, and the illustration you give as well of sort of consuming at one end and throwing your waste to the other end, that has to stop. But I think that's a really powerful image. We've just got time. We're coming up towards one. I'm just going to ask one more question in a moment. I would just suggest anyone who's not looking in the chat, there's lots of good links that have been shared in there from people who are on the call and from our panelists as well. So check those out when you get a chance. But the last question from Elle, if I can put this to you, Duncan, really coming full circle, which works quite nicely with the circular economy, around bio-based materials, and really asking about how realistically can we make those mainstream in the construction industry, and how can we go about doing that?
Yeah, I'm really excited about mycelium. Not only is it one of the most prevalent beings on the planet, but there's a lot of research around the world looking into mycelium to replace plastics. And in particular in London, we've got a company called Biome who accidentally accelerated the consumption rate of fungi consuming plastic by 100%. So there was this type of mycelium, and mycelium is fungus root, that was they noticed in landfill sites was consuming plastic waste, and it used to take it was a sort of 8-year cycle to consume the plastic, and Biome in London got that down to 4 years a couple of years ago. But interestingly, in addition, they're developing products which haven't got BBA certification yet, but they do a rigid insulation panel made out of mycelium, and it's got the same R value and therefore thermal resistance value as the nastiest expanded polyester PIR insulations, but it's got a lot of better fire rating, and of course it's got an end of life strategy, which is to be compost rather than to be floating around our oceans. I'm assured that when they get their BBA certificate, which is taking a long time because the BBA and the BRE have never had to sort of give a certificate to an organic material like mycelium before, that it's going to be marketed at the same price as the normal materials. So that's exciting because that's a game changer, and there are all sorts of mycelium products out there that we're already, if you get a Dell computer at the moment, it's wrapped in mycelium. So mycelium and cardboard. So that's a big deal. One of the other reasons it's a big deal is because it's not going to grab land. We're not going to be, if mycelium takes off, we're not looking for the land to grow it. It can grow in a city environment, urban environments, in dark environments. It's in a factory. So I'm a real fan of, there's a whole sort of menu and palette of bio-based ingredients that I've worked with. But for example, straw, if straw took off as a material, it's great. I did the first load-bearing public building load-bearing straw. That's great, but straw's sewn up pretty much at the moment. We got in the UK, so you'll only be sort of if you're giving it to the construction industry, it won't be going to it's the current industry. So there's a problem when you're fighting over, is it food or construction material?
Yeah, excellent. Okay, well, we're pretty well up against 1 o'clock now, so I would just like to say thank you very much, both of you. It's been really illuminating. Some great observations. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audience have as well. And perhaps if we can just leave with the image of the 250-year-old party is at an end, and we're clearing the table to have an equitable party where everyone's invited. We'll share the food and we'll manage the resources responsibly. So thank you very much, everyone. And
thanks for that, Simon.
You're more than welcome.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And we'll look forward to seeing you all on the next Meshwork call, I think next week. So thank you, everyone.
Bye. Thank
Cheers.
you.